if we really are going to affect climate change and slow it down, it's going to have to be a bottom-up movement. We're going to individually have to decide, I need to do something, whatever that might be. My name is Teresa Bergman. I'm a professor of communication and chair of the communication department at University of the Pacific. I went on this expedition to Svalbard, Norway in June 2023. And it was about 2.5 weeks. And Svalbard is the archipelago of islands that's pretty far north of Norway and actually just about 750 miles south of the North Pole. So it's very, very far north. And this expedition is run by the arcticcircle.org, which is a nonprofit. And one of their main goals is for educators, artists, and scientists to study climate change. So I applied as an educator and was accepted and was supposed to go the summer of 2020. And because of COVID, it got delayed until May 2023. So we went and on this particular expedition, I think there was, things had been delayed quite a while for the group, but of the 30 participants, there were 28 artists and myself and my husband, who's an environmental historian. So my project for this expedition it's a competitive process to be accepted, and it's an international expedition. We had people from 10 different countries of the 30 people there. My project was for my documentary production class, my documentary film production class. I proposed to interview all the people on the expedition and ask them about their projects, what they were doing. And then I would make all of my interviews as well as my B-roll, which is landscape shots, stills, moving images, available to my class in the fall when they make one of their documentaries, which will be on climate change. I found out about it through my husband, actually. He's a professor at CSU Stanislaus. He is a professor of environmental history. And he was at a conference and he had heard about it and asked if I had any interest. And my area of research and where I've been publishing my books has been sites of public memory. So this was not a site of public memory. And, but I said I would think about it because it sounded really interesting. And there is no question climate change needs all of us to pay attention and to do something. And I came up with this project, and he and several people said, this sounds great, you should definitely submit it. And I did, and it was accepted. I was glad, really glad. And it has definitely pushed me in good ways to think about and to actualize what can I do about climate change? What can I do as a concerned environmentalist in my work and personally? Well, I applied for funding from the university and I received it. And so that's how my expenses were covered. And that's why it is tied to the class as well. One thing that I've really taken from this experience and this expedition was how much I appreciate the University of the Pacific supporting me. And I am not a traditional environmental scholar. I'm a communication scholar. And the university had the wherewithal and the insight to realize that these things do intersect. And that when they saw this application for me to go on this expedition, they didn't see me as just in a box. They saw me as a very active and engaged scholar and were willing to invest in how communication around climate change takes place in art and in science and in education. And for that, I am so thankful. I thought it was a life-changing event, and I really couldn't have done it without the university's support. Right, so in Com 134, documentary production, the class that I teach every other year, my students will make 4 short documentaries, 4 short pieces. And I normally assign a form of the documentary. It can be a poetic documentary, it can be observational. I give them all different styles. Participatory is another one, and that's where this one's going to fall under. And this idea of a participatory documentary really focuses on the filmmaker. And this would be the student making their film and their point of view and their issue, and bringing it front and center into the film. So this, the one film that they make, when the topic will be on climate change, this will be a participatory form of documentary, and they can use any portion of the interviews that I shot, any of the images that I shot, or they can make their own, or they can use a combination thereof. It's really their call, how they want to put their film together and how they want to cover and whatever message they want to communicate about climate change. So one of the things I learned on this trip, and I learned quite a bit, really, was how artists create. In each of my interviews with the people on the expedition, what I came to understand is the artistic process. And everybody's artistic process is different. And how important it is to respect your process. And that is the reason these residencies exist, is for these people, since 28 of them were artists, to be artists. And so what that took me to in the interview was asking them, so through your art, after we would have a discussion about their processes, how, and I told them, I come out of communication, and my students are communication students. How does your art communicate climate change? And brilliant answers, just so brilliant, because I did not know the answer to that question, and I didn't know where they would go with it. But almost everyone, to a person, was so articulate and so smart and so insightful about how art communicates. And I think that's one of the things that maybe most people might think, well, of course, art communicates. But coming at it from the creator point of view, and coming at it from, I want to use the word activist, right? Because if we really are going to take climate change seriously, it is going to require some action. So to come at it from an activist point of view, I can generalize that most of the people I interviewed see their art contributing to the conversation, making all of us aware. And it could be viscerally, it could be aesthetically, it could be intellectually, it could be psychically, it could be emotionally. I mean, that's what's so amazing about art. It can reach us on all those levels. Sometimes a piece of art will be more in one direction than another, but you never know. And that was the other thing that was quite cool about all the interviews, is a good portion of the artists weren't really sure how this experience of being in Svalbard and going to see all these glaciers and experiencing the landscape, and then in addition understanding how quickly things are melting. And that's one of the reasons that we actually should circle back to why this expedition was in Svalbard, is that in the entire world, that's where climate change is happening the fastest. So they're seeing the people who live there, it's not a ton of people, in Bay, the town that we took off from and came back to, is only 2,300 people, but the ice is melting at a rate way faster than people anticipated. So everyone who came on this trip was aware of that and concerned with that, and was looking to find ways that would inspire their art and inspire those who see their art or hear their art or participate in their art, because we had all kinds of artists, to understand, be concerned, and take action about climate change. Well, the main thing is for the class in terms of my project. That's what I'm doing. I would say there is definitely a side goal that it was impossible to ignore when I was in that landscape, and just seeing glaciers that are so much further away than they used to be because they're melting so fast, and where they'll be gone in the next 20 to 30 years. I think one of the personal insights I had was it reminded me of sort of the lessons I've taken from the civil rights movements of the 1960s. And it was very much of a bottom-up movement. Everyday people got involved. Everyday people took action, didn't ride the bus. Everyone did something. And so the lesson I took from this is if we really are going to affect climate change and slow it down, which is I think the best we can do right now, it's going to have to be a bottom-up movement. We're going to individually have to decide, I need to do something, whatever that might be. If it's being a vegetarian or a vegan, or if it's driving less or flying less, or whatever it is, if it's working for an organization, whatever that contribution might be, but it needs to happen on that level in order for it to be effective and to keep our world around a little bit longer. And the other thing I thought a lot about was, and because I'm older, it was sort of a new term. It was a term for something that I realized I experienced, but I hadn't heard the term before, was eco-anxiety. And so many of the artists were very concerned with and have their own eco-anxiety. And to grow up in a time and to come of age in a time when you're not sure about the environmental future, where so much of what we hear is more fires, more floods, more intensity, and we see it all the time on the news, and we read about it, that causes a lot of eco-anxiety. And I think that needs to be addressed in terms of, well, how do you grow up? How do you manage to make a life? How do you find any kind of ability to plan for a future if your eco-anxiety is really raging? And that is a concern, and it's real, and it's something that I think almost all of us have to figure out. Hopefully not ignore it, but embrace it and figure out what we'll do. I think one of the things that was wonderful for me on the trip and in terms of my project was talking to all of the artists and learning about their processes and learning about how they do their art and their concerns. Many of them shared with me how they came to art and their history, and why it was just so wonderful for me to hear them talk about their art then in terms of communication, what they really hope all of the artists, because I'm not an artist, what they think their art is communicating, what they hope their art is communicating, knowing full well none of us and whoever, whatever we're creating, have no control over reception, but knowing also full well that we are communicating as creators, and that we're so many of them, when I would talk about their specific arts and what their exhibits might be, what their presentations might be, it was just, there was no denial. There was complete agreement that art communicates. The place where it gets fun and interesting and confusing and wonderful is, well, what does it communicate? And that's great, right? I mean, there's no hypodermic needle when it comes to how communication works, but it does work, and we do take messages, and we do, if we're creative, if we work in rhetoric, if we work at sites of public memory. I'm intensely aware when I go to a site, a new site. I'm working right now, I'm writing a chapter about the Lower East Side Tenement Museum in New York. The choices that are made on what they represent communicate to us, right? They're choices and they're persuasive. I found such a similarity with art. The artists, they're making choices about what to put in their art, what to represent, what they want to be in there. The sound artists that I interviewed from the Netherlands and France were using a lot of the beluga whale sounds, in addition to other sounds that they were picking up underwater for, well, I can't even say for, because intentionality is a little different in art. But one of the things I took from listening to their sounds and looking at some of their previous presentations was, one, it was overwhelming. It was just, it completely pulled me in to their exhibit and gave me room to think about, those are whales. They really are talking to each other. There is no question. There's a back and forth going on. And this is so amazing. And the way their exhibits work is pretty all-encompassing. It's not, well, I had them on headphones, but I could see what their exhibits they were putting together. I left every single one of their pieces that I would look at with them just completely wrapped up in the idea of, oh my God, what if the whales don't exist? We could never have this. What if, what are we doing that would affect oceans so profoundly that we might not be able to have these kinds of experiences? And that is the intersection of art and the environment and communication. And one of the things that they're particularly working on right now that absolutely caught my imagination was much of the drilling on the ocean floor now is for the so-called green revolution, and looking for minerals that we need in our phones and in our computers and our cars as we go electric. But there's been no research done on, well, how does that affect the ocean floor and everybody who lives down there and has their lives? And that's what they're trying to emphasize in their particular sound work. Every day was something incredibly new and interesting and surprising, because I don't come out of the art world, and I would just be so taken with their concerns. One artist, Colin Lyons, told me the story, he's a Canadian, of a horrific environmental disaster. It was a dumping that took place in 2012 on the west coast of Canada. And he was giving me the details about that particular chemical dump from a boat. And there was no research done on the effects of it. It was hundreds of tons. And that's what motivated him to do the kind of work he does, to become an environmental artist. that will communicate environmental concerns through his art. There was another woman, Rebecca Manson from New York, who had this joyous approach to her art and her work that was irresistible. She was so important to her that her art communicates a kind of fresh eyes, fresh experience with the environment. If you could remember the very first time when you were a kid and you ran outside and jumped in leaves, or the first time you felt snow, and she does, and the way she talks about it, it's absolutely infectious. It just made me feel so happy to be human, because she's spending so much of her artistic and drive and creativity in capturing that and representing that in her art. And I just found that great. Everybody was so accomplished. They were just amazing. I had retired university presidents, retired deans, people, another woman who was doing her research on the protozoa that live in the water and making art out of that. Just, it was a really accomplished group. I would say the hardest thing for me was they were all so interesting and so outside my experience that after I'd done 2 interviews, I was kind of done for the day. It was really hard to kind of catch up to where they were at and even pose questions that would be insightful and be helpful, and then also make sure that whatever I was asking would be helpful to my students as well. So that was, it really tested my interviewing skills. And one of the main things I was reinforced and learned again and continue to learn is the best interviewer is somebody who listens very, very closely. And that's why I had to have good sound, listening to everyone. And because often when you're interviewing, and that's something I try to share with my students and teach in my documentary class, you'll ask a question and the people will give some sort of pretty straightforward answer, nothing terribly emotional, just pretty straightforward, but there'll be one thing in there. There'll be one word, one phrase, and you're like, what? Wait, what was that? And then that's where the fabulous interview is. That's when you ask that question, well, wait, what did you say about being youthful? I think with Rebecca is what opened up that whole part of her, because it was very clear she had done, and almost everybody had done quite a few interviews. They were really used to being interviewed, being on camera, talking to journalists kind of people. And I don't consider myself a journalist. And certainly in this particular case, more a documentarist. And part of what documentary folks do that's different than journalism is, if you listen close enough, you are going to develop a relationship so that your conversation on camera is more than just who, what, where, how, when. It's much more, you get into motivation and you get into ideas, you get into history, and you get into thoughts about the future. And that's always hard. I'm working on my 3rd book right now, which is the future directions and commemoration, bringing women, people of color, and the working class into the commemorative landscape. And I'm looking at sites that, all U.S. sites that are looking at, that are commemorating these groups of people, which is a really different approach to commemoration in the U.S. I think one of the things that is going to affect everyone, like the first chapter I wrote was on the Anthracite Coal Museum in eastern Pennsylvania. And when we look at coal mining and its history and what's going on now in the future, you can't have that conversation without talking about climate change. This is part of the environment. The place that I'm looking at now, the Lower East Side Tenement Museum, climate change affects everyone's work. So when people are first coming over, immigrating to the U.S., one of the first things you got to do is figure out your job, how you're going to make money. There's climate change, right? How is it going to work? The next site that my next chapter is on the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Memorial. And that's where about 127 young women, mostly immigrants, Jews and Italians, jumped to their death because of a fire. And it was on the 8th and 9th floor of the building, and none of the fire equipment went up that high. The ladders went to the 6th floor. So most people died by jumping out the window. Well, when we look at contemporary sweatshops, when we look at which exist all around the world, we've seen fires in all kinds of places now. This is not something that only happened in the early 20th century. How are we helping the workers? What are we doing? It's much hotter now. We have all kinds of other issues we have to take into consideration when it comes to worker safety and health. So I think in many ways, when I think about climate change, it's something that I will keep in mind as I go through each of these sites and looking at them and thinking about, well, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory led to all kinds of OSHA. Well, it led to OSHA, straightforward. It led to creating workplace regulations to protect us. And coal mining has had all kinds of issues, to put it mildly. And all of the sites have to take it into consideration in terms, especially when we think about environmental racism and how it affects people of color and working class people who maybe don't have the means to move and to go someplace else where it's not so affected. These are considerations that need to be part of any analysis of what we're learning when we go to these sites of public memory. I think one of the things is probably eating less meat, because that has a tremendous environmental effect, trying to stay more plant-based, going in that direction. Continuing to support all the organizations that I support that are doing climate-based work, and supporting any kind of legislation that works in that direction to limit carbon emissions.